Hi, my name is Stephanie Katz, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Birmingham in the Department of English Literature in the College of Arts and Law. And my poster refers to mapping fantasy. I'm looking at the intersection of narrative structure and world building, particularly within the field of fantasy literature. So for my poster, I decided to kind of take the viewer on a bit of a map that sort of leads through my paper topic. So the purpose of my research is to look at how narrative and world building work together, because often world building and the world in which the fantasy characters live and engage in their adventures is secondary to the narrative itself, at least in academic study. So I really wanted to bring more attention to the fact that these two components work really hand in hand in a way that is unique to the fantasy genre, unlike novels or science fiction or dystopian fiction. So the purpose of my research is to really kind of delve into how these two fields work together. And in doing that, my methodologies, I'm using narratology and looking at the structure of fantasy literature stories, particularly 21st century fantasy, because it is something that is contemporary and there are a lot of progressive themes in 21st century literature, fantasy literature, that have not been as seen in sort of 20th century literature, such as writers like Tolkien and Lewis. We're seeing a lot more of multicultural fantasies develop and different types of narrators that aren't your typical hero's journey like the Frodos or the Luke Skywalkers. So in narrative structure, I want to look at how fantasy is changing and how the narratives are evolving into sort of multi-personal protagonists. And I want to look at how these voices reflect more cultures than just your typical white Caucasian male protagonist. I'm also looking at literary geography because that is part of what works in building the fantasy world. So when you look at a fantasy world, not only does it encompass just the geography of the landscape, but it also takes into account cultures. You know, if you look at Lord of the Rings, you have your elves, you have your dwarves, you have your hobbits, you have all these different people, and they have different histories, they have different mythologies, and fantasy cultures are very diverse, and they have incredibly detailed histories that sort of add this richness to this world and sort of make you suspend your disbelief and enter into this secondary reality in a way that other types of novels and fictional genres aren't able to. So in a unique way, this world is multifaceted and it helps shape the narrative, because depending on who your protagonist is and where they come from and what their heritage is as a created people, it shows the types of goals that they'll have, the types of fears that they'll have to overcome, and the types of obstacles that they'll have to overcome in terms of, you know, when they cross boundaries into new lands and new cultures. So in my methodology, I'm also looking at close reading. I'm reading these books, these series. The three that I've chosen are the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, who is an African-American author and comes to the field with a really unique feminist viewpoint that is not typically seen in fantasy literature. I'm also looking at the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss, which is a little bit more of your traditional masculine journey through a medieval type of setting, but it's built on the premises of creating a legendary character. And then I'm also looking at the Chronicles of the Unhewn Throne by Brian Stavely. And what's interesting about this series is that there are three major narrators. They're a family of brothers and sisters, so you get sort of that male and female viewpoint and narrative structure, and they're coming at it from different ages, different positions that they have been assigned to within their family hierarchy, and they're subverting sort of the norm of what has been the standard of how their culture has been ruled for generations. So what I hope to find in my research is how these different pieces sort of fit together and build this rich field of fantasy literature, and to show that that secondary worlds and world building is just as important as narrative, and it actually helps to drive narrative. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for listening, and check out my poster.